Good evening, and welcome to InDepthNH.org's conversation on one of the most important and often most complicated topics facing New Hampshire today, taxes. We're fortunate to be joined tonight by two individuals who have spent years helping Granite Staters understand exactly how public policy, budgets, and economic trends affect everyday life. Phil Sletton, Research Director at the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy, and Gary Rayno, InDepthNH.org's State House Bureau Chief. New Hampshire native Phil Sletton has become one of New Hampshire's leading voices on state fiscal policy and economics. His work focuses on the state budget, revenues and expenditures, housing affordability, healthcare costs, demographic and workforce trends. Before joining the Institute, Phil served as a performance auditor with the New Hampshire Office of Legislative Budget Assistant, bringing a deep understanding of how state government works and how policy decisions affect people on the ground. Phil is known for something that is harder to do than it sounds, making complex public policy understandable. Whether he is explaining property taxes, state revenues, economic trends, or the pressures New Hampshire families face, he brings careful research, clear data, and a nonpartisan approach to these issues. Also here tonight is InDepthNH.org's very own Gary Rayno. Through his widely read column, Distant Dome, he brings readers thoughtful reporting, historical perspective, and hard-earned insight into what's really happening in Concord and why it matters to the communities across the state. Over a career spanning more than 4 decades, Gary has covered the New Hampshire State House for In-Depth NH, the New Hampshire Union Leader, and other news organizations. He's built a reputation as one of the state's most respected political journalists. Gary's reporting connects policy debates to everyday life, whether the issue is taxes, education funding, state spending, housing, or the shifting priorities of elected officials. He brings context, institutional memory, and a deep understanding of how decisions are made in Concord. Gary has covered everything from local government and school boards to presidential primaries and statewide policy battles. There are few people better equipped to help us understand the long story behind today's tax debates. Joining us as well on the panel is Nancy West, founder of New Hampshire Center for Public Interest Journalism, which publishes InDepthNH.org. Under Nancy's leadership, InDepthNH has become one of the most trusted sources for in-depth reporting on government, politics, healthcare, and the environment. Her career is devoted to watchdog journalism and public service. Please join me in thanking Nancy West for her leadership and for making informed civic conversation like tonight's possible. My name is Beverly Stoddard. I will be your moderator for the event. We have a great program tonight to answer your questions. So we ask you to please submit your questions through the chat, and we will get to as many as we can in the next hour and a half. And we thank you for joining us. We'll begin with a few words from each of our guests, and we're going to start with Phil Sletton. Hi, Phil.
Hello, Beverly, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'll try to live up to all of that. And I wanted to talk first about when we're talking about taxes, because we're here tonight to talk about taxes. I want to share just 2 slides to show what that looks like. What does that look like graphically? What do the numbers look like when we're talking about taxes in New Hampshire? And the first slide I'm going to share is actually not about taxes. It's about taxes and everything else. And I'm hoping everyone can see this slide. This is a graph from our report on property taxes that we released back in April. What this is showing is all state and local government revenue in New Hampshire. And when I say local governments, what am I talking about? I'm talking about counties, cities, towns, and school districts. So those are all included, as well as the state government. This is the whole picture, and this is data from the U.S. Census Bureau. It was collected for fiscal year 2022, so it's a few years old. And you can see the array of revenue sources on your screen. Now, the reason I'm talking about this broader picture is there is a significant amount of revenue that governments collect that is not tax revenue. And when we're talking about the state government in particular, about 33% of the current state budget is funded with federal transfers, revenue that comes from the federal government to the state to fund programs. That includes programs like the federal match for Medicaid, which is a state federal fiscal partnership to provide health coverage to people with very limited means, usually limited incomes and relatively few assets. Those transportation funding dollars, funding for veterans care and for the National Guard, funding for the Supplementary Nutrition Assistance Program, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Program, the Women, Infants, and Children Nutrition Assistance Program. Those are all federal funds that flow into the state and into the state budget to fund those services, to help support those services. Those dollars might be paid with taxes at the federal level, but they are state revenue that are not tax dollars, right? So that's important to remember when we're talking about tax dollars. That's not the whole picture when it comes to what funds state government or what funds local governments. The federal funds aren't as big a deal when it comes to local governments. They were about 2% of revenue to local governments in the year that we're looking at here. But there are other slices of the pie that are pretty important for local governments, and that's in particular the green slice that you can see here, the property tax slice of the pie. And that is a tax revenue source. Like I said, this pie is a mix of tax and non-tax revenue sources. I do want to point out, for example, liquor store revenue is on here. The state revenue that is not a tax revenue source because it is the state selling products at state liquor stores. That's a state operation. The State Liquor Commission exists to raise revenue for other state services and to control the supply of liquor to a certain extent in New Hampshire. And as a result, New Hampshire relies more than any other state on liquor store revenue than any other state in the country, I should say, as a percentage of its funding. That shows up here. Lottery revenues are in that other non-tax revenue slice, right? Those revenues are not tax revenues. At least the state lottery revenues are not tax revenues. Some other parts of the Lottery Commission's oversight, you could argue whether it is a tax or not, but those are activities that are legalized to generate a profit for state government for other purposes. But you can see there are other taxes here. So we don't have a general sales tax in New Hampshire, so that's zero. We do have some selective sales taxes, and we'll talk about those in a moment. You can see here individual income tax. That was 1% of this total amount of revenue. That was the state's interest and dividends tax. It has since been repealed, so you won't see it on you will only see a little bit of it on the next pie chart. Corporate income tax, that's our state's business profits and business enterprise tax. So that's what you can see on this pie chart, as well as some other taxes. So this is the whole picture. Let's just zoom in on the taxes component. And that taxes component looks like this. This is the breakdown for state and local taxes. So again, not including those other funds like federal funds and liquor commission revenue and lottery commission revenue. This is state and local taxes and not including federal taxes. So here you can see local property taxes are more than half of the tax revenue raised by state and local governments in New Hampshire. The statewide education property tax, which you can see shaded in green next to those local property taxes, that is a state tax, but all of the revenue is raised and retained locally. And that raised and retained locally revenue means that if we take the total picture of taxes in New Hampshire, about 63% of tax revenue raised these are data for 2025, about 63% comes from a property tax that is raised and retained locally, even though some of it, a small portion, is state tax revenue. Then you can see the rest of the tax revenue sources, which are mostly state tax revenue sources. There are a few other local taxes that the Census Bureau calculates and estimates are local taxes, but most of the rest are state tax revenue sources. The business profits tax, which is your typical state corporate income tax, roughly, is the largest state tax revenue source. The business enterprise tax is sort of its much smaller companion that taxes compensation, interest, and dividends paid or accrued by a business operating in the state. The meals and rentals tax is probably the one you see most often. That's a state tax in terms of a bill that you directly pay if you, for example, go out to eat or rent a hotel room or a rental car in the state. That's the meals and rentals tax. The Medicaid enhancement tax is paid by hospitals to help fund Medicaid services and reimbursements to hospitals for certain care they provide. The real estate transfer tax is mostly based on the buying and selling of single family houses in the state. That's most of the activity. And it's both a tax on both the buyer and the seller. However, it does impact commercial property. Commercial property is taxed, and the sale of either commercial property or interest in commercial property is also taxed. The motor fuels tax is on gasoline, diesel fuel, and jet fuel. It's taxed at a different rate. The insurance premium tax is a tax on insurance companies for the premiums they charge. The tobacco tax is mostly a tax on cigarettes, but also includes other tobacco products, as well as certain vaping products are included in that as well. And the interest and dividends tax you can see here is it brought in $73 million in state fiscal year 2025. In state fiscal year 2024, it brought in $184 million. It was phased out and has been phased out. It's not going to bring in any significant revenue, just a few $1,000,000 from sort of cleanup audits in state fiscal year 2026. And then you can see other state taxes and other local taxes are pretty small slices of the pie. So it's a pretty diverse picture of revenue sources on the state side in terms of tax revenue sources. And on the local side, you can see that it's primarily property taxes. At least on the tax revenue front, it's almost entirely property taxes. Property taxes make up the majority of total revenue, tax and non-tax revenue, that local governments in New Hampshire collect, and is really the only significant tax revenue source that local governments have, because it is the only significant one that the state government in its laws allows them to have. So that's a quick rundown of what taxes look like in New Hampshire numerically. And I'm happy to either hand it back to Beverly or hand it directly to Gary, whichever you'd prefer, Beverly, and answer questions after we hear Gary's insights.
Gary, would you like to go ahead and speak to what you'd like to say?
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that glowing introduction to Beverly.
I meant every word to both of you.
Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit of how we got where we are now. Any discussion of taxes and how we arrived where we are today has to begin with the infamous pledge, and today's other anti-tax slogan, the New Hampshire Advantage. The pledge to oppose any broad-based tax, income, or sales tax has been around since the 1950s, when it was associated with former Governor Wesley Powell. If you go back a little further to the early 1950s, then Governor Sherman Adams proposed both an income and a sales tax to corral a ballooning post-war deficit. The legislature killed both off, and Adams said later he should have only proposed an income tax and he probably would have been successful. Well, we'll never know. So there were concerns about income and sales taxes before 1972, when the pledge took on its allure as a deadly political weapon and one of the mainstays of Republican campaigns. The pledge's rise began after former Governor Walter Peterson appointed a task force to overhaul the state's antiquated tax system. That system, like the one today, depended on property taxes to fund almost all of local government. Property taxes made sense when land was wealth and it could produce a good living either from farming or timber harvesting, or selling off a lot here or there. But the coming of the industrial age replaced our agricultural way of life. People were paid steady wages and no longer had to worry about the weather impacting their harvest. The tax system also relied on the stock and trade tax, which was a property tax assessed on machinery and inventory. Peterson's task force produced a two-phase plan. The first to reform business taxes, and the second to overhaul individual and local taxation. The business tax reform produced the business profits tax, an income tax on a company's profits. The stock and trade tax was repealed, replaced by the rooms and meals tax, with the state agreeing to share some of its proceeds with the cities and towns to replace the money they lost from the stock and trade repeal. The business tax reform package passed the legislature in 1971, and the second phase was planned for the next term with a 3% income tax to help lower reliance on local property taxes. Running for re-election in 1972, Peterson faced a familiar nemesis in the Republican gubernatorial primary, Meldrum Thompson. As Orford School Board's chairman, Thompson gained notoriety by refusing all federal aid because he said there were too many strings attached. Thompson had lost to Peterson in gubernatorial primaries 2 times before, but the 1972 election was different. Another Peterson nemesis, union leader publisher William Loeb, was relentless against the 2-term governor, hammering him almost daily with the pledge and his income tax plan, fitting like a glove with Thompson's axe the tax slogan. After Thompson won the primary, the pledge became political gospel for future elections, even today. With Peterson's defeat, there was no income tax, and that created a structural deficit that has plagued state finances on and off since. Eventually, the pledge would have to share the anti-tax spotlight with Governor Steve Merrill's New Hampshire Advantage, which he coined for his 1972 gubernatorial election. Over time, the two slogans have come to mean no new taxes and no tax increases, period. And it's not only Republicans who have lived by the pledge. Candidates from both parties have rode its coattails into the corner office and the House and Senate chambers. But the pledge has also meant there has been few to no opportunities to have an open discussion of what the state's tax structure should be in the 21st century. By some blips, lawmakers passed an income tax through both the House and the Senate in 1999, but in 2 different versions. And the bill died when then Governor Jeanne Shaheen, who had taken the pledge, very publicly told the House and Senate she would veto the bill if they put it on her desk. 2 years later, she would propose a sales tax that was dead on arrival, after she became the first governor to refuse to take the pledge since Peterson. 4 years later, the state instituted the business enterprise tax under Merrill. It was in reaction to a lawsuit filed by the founders of Cabletron, who had to pay the business profits tax. At the same time, law firms, physicians' practices, engineering firms, and their like did not. Professional organizations instead used their profits for end-of-year bonuses for themselves. The business enterprise tax took care of that loophole by assessing wages, interest and dividends, and capital. It is essentially a value-added tax like those in Europe that has replaced income taxes in many countries. The BET was originally assessed at 0.25%, but was bumped up to 0.75% in 2000 to produce additional money to address the Claremont education lawsuit. The other major overhaul of the tax system was several years ago when lawmakers repealed the interest and dividends tax, the one levy that actually taxes wealth or income. And about a decade ago, Republicans holding the majority in the legislature sought to put the state's business tax system into reverse by cutting both tax rates. The talking point at the time was that the state's BPT rate was higher than Massachusetts. So if the state was going to be competitive regionally, it needed to be at least as low as the base states. When they began, the BPT rate was 8.5%, and the BET rate was 0.75%. Now the BPT rate is 7.5%. They took a 1% off it, and the BET is 0.55%. My colleague Phil estimated those business tax reductions cost the state more than $1 billion in foregone revenue. However, cutting revenues does not change the state's needs. Those needs don't go away. They have to be addressed someplace. And as we saw with the most recent state budget, there is not enough revenue. The university system aid was slashed. Poor mothers on Medicaid have to pay premiums for their children's health insurance. The working poor have to pay higher copays and copays, and his state safety net, the Department of Health and Human Services, struggles to serve the same number of people with more than $100 million less than it had in the biennium before. New Hampshire spends less than any other state for public education support and is near the bottom in support from municipalities. So when the state cuts programs because they don't have the money, those costs downshift to the local level and increase property taxes, which is what this is really all about. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Well said. And Nancy West, would you like to join us in this conversation and give us your ideas?
Oh, I'm just thrilled everybody showed up tonight. We have more people on this call than I can remember for any event we've ever held. You know, I'm not the only one who's been grousing about my property taxes, apparently, and you know, how fast they're going up. And this is just brilliant. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Phil, for, you know, this information. I haven't put it together like this, you know, and I lived through, you know, I was reporting during a lot of it, not all of it. I'm not that old, almost. But it's just, you know, the pledge. I can remember when I was at the Union Leader for many years reporting with Gary. You know, that doomed so many candidates. It actually didn't even doom them because they didn't take it on. You know, there's just something that people, it's like the hot potato, you know, taxes in New Hampshire. And that's what, just grousing about it with friends and board members here at InDepthNH.org, we sent out an email to we have 17,000 plus subscribers, and did a couple of stories. And we had over 70 responses from people just not asking, do you like it? Do you not like it? And just saying, you know, tell us what your thoughts are. And we got 70 really great responses from people. Many of them were, you know, just from the heart. You know, I got one of the letters we got said, you know, a woman wrote, she said, I heard an elderly neighbor crying at town hall last year because they couldn't pay their property taxes. And people talking about possibly having to sell their home and even leave the state, or especially, we got quite a few from older people and young families. What I also noticed from the responses, and we published them all on InDepthNH.org, it took 6 different nights to get them all, you know, posted, because many of them were really well-researched opinion pieces on their own, talking about ideas they've thought out about trying to, you know, change the system, you know, and they were just really smart, you know, good bits of information. But tonight it's really great to hear it all put together, Phil and Gary, you know. One writer was, you know, this is pretty honest. No one wants to pay taxes, but we need to make it as fair as we can. And that, you know, that summed up what a lot of people had. And a lot of people went into great lengths. They've really done their homework. And I hope they're on the Zoom, the YouTube call tonight, and mention their comments, because, you know, they're really impressive. But there's a lot of political people, a lot of political leaders. The only conversation anybody, like you said, Gary, Democrat or Republican, for the most part, there are some changes in that coming. But you know, I forgot what I was going to say, so never mind. uh, okay, usually somebody cues me like what I was talking about, but that's not going to happen. So anyway,
Well,
I
good
also
comments,
don't
though.
want to forget to talk about InDepthNH.org. Just quickly, just a brief rundown. We started 11 years ago, and you know, we probably had, you know, 30 people who went online to find us, and they were friends and family. And you know, last year we had over two plus million in unique readers, and probably another 600,000 readers who found our stories on other news outlets. And like I said, over 17,000 readers on the daily newsletter that we put out. It's just phenomenal growth at a time when, news media in general is just really taking a beating. So I like to brag a little bit, and this was just coincidence. But today happens to be New Hampshire Gives, and that's the one day of giving every year that is put on for New Hampshire's nonprofits. And over 700 nonprofits signed up for this 24 hours of donating tax deductible donations to some of the wonderful nonprofits we have. And that includes InDepthNH.org and Phil's New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, which I read, everything. They let us use a lot of their stories and work because how would we know this stuff otherwise? We've lost 75% of all news jobs in the last 20 years. So we need people like Phil at the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute doing some of the digging. And we need people like Gary with his historic memory of, I hate to, age myself, but I met Mel Thompson. I've interviewed him. That's a long time ago, but that pledge has really, really made a big difference in New Hampshire. And, I just want to mention what we do at InDepth. Our mission is to hold the powerful accountable and to give voice to marginalized people, places, and ideas. And so just the turnout for tonight and these terrific presentations about a really important topic, I think we'll, hopefully be doing more of these. And thanks all of you folks. Beverly, thanks for the great introduction for everybody. And Beverly is best known for herding cats whenever we do anything online, and does it so beautifully. And we so appreciate it. I don't want to keep talking.
Nope, Nancy, we've got questions coming in. We have questions coming into the chat now, so we're going to begin with that. I've got Stephen NH is asking, does anybody know if there's been a study as to how much income legalized cannabis would bring to New Hampshire? Why hasn't it been approached yet?
So I can speak. Oh, Gary, go ahead if you wanted to speak to it.
Go ahead, Phil.
I was going to note that there have been a few bills and there have been a few fiscal notes associated with those bills, right? Estimates that are official state estimates, and they're in the tens of millions of dollars a year, right? So it is, if you had asked me what does legalizing cannabis in New Hampshire look like in 2014, then I think we'd have a very different story because right now all of the geographies around us, and I say geographies because I'm including Quebec in that, right? To my knowledge, they all have legalized cannabis to some degree or another, right? If we were to be the only state in the region, then we'd get a lot more cross-border traffic. But right now, the cross-border traffic is going the other direction. Obviously, it depends on how you structure it. You could have a really aggressive tax rate and probably raise more until a certain point in which you may not raise as much more, right? Because people then will still cross border if it's going to be cheaper in other places. And there's other ways you could structure what is the volume, who's selling it, how many legal entities are there in terms of what can be sold. So that can all adjust the number, but it's probably tens of millions of dollars, not hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars, right? So it's not a big fundamental shift. It would be a significant one, but not a big fundamental shift.
It would help, or is what you're saying. It would help the picture.
It would bring in revenue, right? They
It
would
would bring
definitely,
in
I mean,
revenue.
unless you didn't tax it, which some people would argue you should legalize it and not tax it. But if you legalized it and taxed it, it would bring in revenue that the
Yeah.
state does not otherwise have currently.
The Sunday Boston Globe, I want to say a month or two back, though, they ran a fairly lengthy story about the problems that the marijuana sellers in Massachusetts are having, that the costs have gone down, the cost to produce it is higher, but people aren't buying as much. It seems like it's a shifting kind of a commodity.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think part of what we're seeing there is the patchwork of what is legal where and how is it accessible. The federal government changing it from a Schedule 1 drug to a different part on the schedule as they proposed, like that's something that could change what the costs are for businesses, how easy it is for businesses to engage in the banking system, right, in terms of the sales of those products, which right now, because it's a Schedule 1 drug at the federal level, that prevents some of the access to banks
Right, right,
that help them run their businesses, right? So
right.
there's federal and state policy changes that I think create a patchwork there. And also, it's not costless, and I can't speak to what the costs are in quantified terms, but it's not costless in terms of there being no negative externalities, right? No, it is not there's no negative effect associated with, marijuana use, for example. It's just a question of what is that effect if it's legalized versus not legalized, but there are still lots of users out there, right? So
Yeah.
those are all important policy questions.
Well, and I think the change in the legality of it is a good thing for everybody, but that's simply my opinion. Okay, I've got Adam Hurd, 9230, wrote, I understand that the gas tax has not gone up for many years, but road repair expenses certainly have increased. How has this shortfall been covered? Any
Yeah.
idea, Gary, where you think that, or Phil, whoever?
Well, I
Well,
was gonna hand it back to Gary for a little bit more on marijuana. I think he wanted to
Oh,
chime
okay.
in, but I'm happy to address the gas tax one too after Gary does.
from the marijuana, I mean, we're not going to be seeing any change in the marijuana anytime soon because as long as Kelly Ayotte is the governor of the state of New Hampshire, she does not want legalized marijuana here. So if she's reelected, it's another 2 years before anybody can even think about that. In terms of the transportation, I mean, this is a hot topic right now because we raised the gas tax about 15 years ago, I'm saying. I think,
It was 2015 was the yeah.
but it's been like 2015. And it had been like 30 years before that, before it had been raised again. So it's been a while. And it's still pretty low compared to most other states around here. The other problem that we have is we have this thing called a TIFIA loan, which is a federal low interest loan, which we took out to finish off the I-93 expansion down in Salem. And this year we had to start paying the principal of that, which takes away about $35 million a year right off the top. So it's a tough. The New Hampshire 10-year highway plan, which was just approved, is in a pretty tough shape because it needs a lot more money than they have right now. They put a toll increase through both the House and the Senate, double the tolls for out-of-state drivers but Kelly Ayotte is making noises that she might be vetoing it. So if that happens, then it's going to be a whole lot less money than we're hoping for. It's a tough shot. It's really tough right now in terms of the transportation system.
So the roads are going to stay the way they are as
They're not going to get substantially better, no.
okay. Bill, did you have anything else on that?
Yeah, just relative, and sorry, Gary, we have had a connection interruption, so I thought you had paused her after saying 15 years ago. I didn't mean to jump in on that. So yeah, the 2015 gas tax increase, by the way, I should know, is a 4.2%, a 4.2 cent per gallon increase. And it's a temporary one. I believe it's a 20-year time window because it's associated with the expansion of I-93 and paying that off. So technically, that gasoline tax will go back down to 18 cents if current law isn't changed, for example. And it was set to 18 cents, I think, in 1991. Now, notice I'm not talking about percentages there, even though I almost hiccuped and said percent there when I should have said cents. I'm not talking about percentages, I'm talking about cents. So the 22.2 cents per gallon, that is the gas tax right now, or the motor fuels tax here in New Hampshire, that is a fixed amount of dollars, right? And, as people drive more, you generate more, but it's not adjusted for inflation and not adjusted for what those cost changes are for road repairs, for hiring people to work on the roads, for asphalt and things, especially oil-based products, right? Those all change in cost. And those costs, if they change faster than inflation, or in this case, just faster than the amount of gasoline that's sold increases, which, by the way, does not increase every year. Cars are getting more efficient, which is a good thing for household costs and good things, for other reasons. But it does not, we don't have robust year-over-year growth in the amount of gasoline that's sold, right? So that means that it's a limited amount of revenue relative to the increases in costs. Now, um, part of the question was, how has the state paid for those road repairs over time? And to a certain extent, it is, well, how much has the state paid for road repairs? How much has it relied on federal funds? Because the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, for example, brought in a lot of federal funds to help transportation infrastructure. And how much has it relied on other tax revenue sources? The highway fund, which there's the highway fund and the turnpike fund, which is most of what we're talking about here. The highway fund has received infusions of general fund dollars for over 4 successive budgets. There were surplus general fund dollars that were put towards both state and local highway and road and bridge infrastructure. So those one-time infusions helped offset these costs. And in the most recent state budget, when there was not a surplus of general fund dollars, when this current state budget entered with a general fund deficit, right, drew from the rainy day fund at the beginning of it to balance the prior budget, there weren't excess general fund dollars. So what policymakers did is they raised motor vehicle registration fees, as well as a bunch of other fees. And those motor vehicle registration fees also go to support the highway fund. And also some of them, depending on which one you're looking at, have not been raised for a long time, and they're a certain dollar amount that's set in statute. So that is another source of money that is a dedicated source of money for road and bridge infrastructure in the state, and that has been increased.
Okay, great. I want to say, Michael Cahill 2403, I don't have a complete question. If you would want to resubmit your question, I'll read it for you. And then I've got at NH-Dem. Amen to Gary's knowledge. Look to his stories of the legislature actions to truly understand what is going on. You got a fan out there, Gary. Okay, I've got David Auger, -IM2BD. Is there a portion of the state that's ahead leading an alternative revenue conversation? Is somebody leading the way? Oh, that's an answer right there.
The only thing I hear from politicians is no, not never, no way. Are they even going to talk about it? Period.
Well, and then, we had a press conference yesterday from Jason Osborne, who was the House Majority Leader, and says, give me 40 more Republicans and I'll make sure you never have an income tax. So,
Wow.
There's not much discussion going on. The one sort of discussion that's out there is Andy Valinsky's 3-3 plan, which is 3% income tax with plenty of offsets and a $3 per thousand statewide property tax. Current statewide property tax is about $1 now. So it would be basically tripling that. And the way it's set up, it would largely hit second homeowners.
And to show how popular that was, as soon as Andrew Valinsky announced that, he received death threats on social media. So this is a very passionate issue for a lot of people. I didn't mean to interrupt, Gary.
Well, I think too, like I said, it's this whole thing with the pledge and the New Hampshire Advantage is basically stopped any real discussion of overhauling the state's tax system. We just haven't had a serious discussion about it.
Yeah, and that stops everything.
Actually, neither party, obviously the Republicans don't want it, but the Democrats don't really want it either. So we're just not going to see much of anything unless we start changing some of the people that are sitting in the seats in Concord.
Okay, back to at NH-Dem to fill this time. If we were to try instituting the billionaire tax in New Hampshire, how much revenue would that likely bring?
So I can't answer that for two reasons. One is, for billionaire tax, are we talking about taxing wealth, taxing income, taxing just the income of billionaires, taxing the wealth of billionaires, right? There's a lot of things that a billionaire tax could mean. So I don't know what it means specifically, but what I can say is if we look at the second reason is that I don't have data that's broken down. We have IRS data that allows us to break down tax returns. So from federal tax returns published in aggregate by the Internal Revenue Service, we don't have that to the billionaire level. I can tell you that in tax year 2022, there were 3,600 tax returns in New Hampshire that had over $1 million in adjusted gross income, for example. And a little bit broader than that, if we look at the top 1% of filers by income in New Hampshire. That was about 6,800 filers, probably something in the $800,000 a year income range, or that's probably what about it would be today, probably more like $700,000 then. That top 1% of filers from all income sources that were reported in their adjusted gross income, not necessarily all that was taxed, right? But all that was reported, that was a little over $15 billion in income, right? That was in that top 1% of households in New Hampshire in tax year 2022. So depending on what type of income in that $15 billion you're looking to tax and at what rate, and by the way, close to half of it is capital gains income, for example. That's the minority of it is salaries and wages, which is most of what it is for the rest of the income groups. Um, that's $15 billion that came in that year. So what tax rate are you applying to what types of income? Is that the universe you're looking at with a billionaire's tax? Those are all the sorts of questions I would have in response to that question. But there's a fair bit of money at the highest end of the income spectrum.
Okay, Ellis Robinson 8888 is saying losing the interest and dividends tax was a huge blow. At the same time, other states have found that if a new tax is dedicated to a specific use, it has a much better chance of winning. What do you think on an interest and dividends tax, a specific use tax?
I don't think we're going to see a reenactment of the dividends tax anytime soon. Well, it's always a good idea to do something like that, but they're lawmakers and they make laws, which means that they can change laws. So they may dedicate the tax to the education trust fund, and 2 years from now they may pass a law to say no, we're not going to give it to the education trust fund. I mean, we had just this year they put in a new thing for the video lottery terminals, and everything. This is a constitutional amendment that anything that basically the lottery commission touches has to go to the education trust fund. But they carved out that 75% of the money from the new video lottery terminals are going to the general fund and 25 to the education. Somebody's going to challenge that eventually, I'm pretty sure, but that's what you run up against, and that's why it's a tough sell.
Okay. At Will Wen is saying, have Phil and Gary ever collaborated with Andrew Volinsky regarding how reliant the state and school districts and towns and cities are upon the property?
Property tax, I'm seeing.
I would assume it's property tax, yes.
So go ahead, Gary. Sorry. I was just going to say, for those who want to learn more about property taxes in New Hampshire, we did publish back in early April a report on property taxes in New Hampshire. If you want to delve through and look at page by page and also look at interstate comparisons, I'd encourage folks to look at that. That was something that the question was around collaboration. I could say that we produced that independently at NHFPI, and that's a resource that's out there and available. I think Gary's written about it, and I think that Andrew's read it, but I can't speak to any further use that they've had about it.
Okay.
Oh, it's fascinating. I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but just how some states, some municipalities have such higher rates and have so much higher percentage of their income going to, fund schools, and it was just property taxes. And Gary, that was a kind of a hallmark of this session as well, for a lot of the different things that are because of what the legislators were doing and talking about, that are going to get dumped back down to the property taxpayers.
Mm. It's been going on for quite a while.
Not just this session.
No, I mean, well, you just have to go, I mean, think back to like, when was that? 2010. They stopped, the state used to pay 35% of the retirement costs for the other people, other subdivisions of the state retirement system, the town workers, the school district, or teachers and school district employees, and county employees. And all of a sudden they stopped paying their 35%. And it would just dump, I mean, it pushed millions and millions of dollars down to the local taxpayer. And they never put the money back in. So, you know, it's
With the just a check. Ellis Robinson again at 8888 said, what do you think about reinstalling the interest and dividends tax with revenue dedicated to education and offsetting property taxes?
well, I mean, the interest and dividends tax in its best days was it's about 146,000. I mean, excuse me, 146 million, somewhere in there usually. And that's a nice number, but you really want to reduce property taxes, it's got to be a lot higher number than that. You know, it's got to be up around at least $500 million, which is what the last court case said, basically, that told the state to raise it up to $500 million. And it's got to be something like that. Andy's plan raises $1 billion. And when you start talking about $1 billion, you're talking about lowering property taxes, and a pretty good number. But at 100 million, not really. It would help some, but it's not going to do an awful lot. You're not going to see a big change.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Yes.
Beverly, if I could, I'll peg a number to that property taxes statewide each year are about $5 billion. So when we're talking about $100 million or $200 million, it's not going to be a big percentage change, still potentially a meaningful change, but not a big percentage change relative to that total. And there have been a couple questions about dedicating revenue and what if we dedicated revenue in one way or another. As Gary noted, policymakers have this flexibility. There are two places where revenue is dedicated in the state constitution. One is motor vehicle related revenues, so registration fees and gasoline taxes have to go for highway related purposes. And the other is that the state lottery, which is I'm not an attorney. This is not legal advice. I don't know how a court would rule on this, but the state lottery itself is narrower than everything that's under the Lottery and Gaming Commission. But the state lottery has to go to public schools. That revenue has to go to public schools. Other than that, everything is a creature of state law that lawmakers can change. So, for example, the tolls that are on our 89 miles of turnpike and support those 89 miles of turnpike, the reason those are limited to support those 89 miles is a state law, and policymakers can change that if they want to in any legislative session, right? If they wanted to do so. So in terms of dedicating revenue and not dedicating revenue, I think Gary's point that laws can change because policymakers decide is very important, because most of these structures, including whether the state has to have a balanced budget or not, most of these structures are just creatures of state law. They are not imposed or a stickier, harder to change, if you will, that something written in the Constitution is, for example.
Okay. Live Free, Love It. All he's written is Andrew Volinsky's 3-3 tax plan. I don't have a question to go along with that if you want to resubmit something. And Michael Cahill is saying, my comments were about the lack of a tax amnesty for property taxes, only for the business taxes. Also, the most recent estimate for cannabis was $40 million a year or two after it's enacted. He's also noting here that I'd enjoy hearing them discuss the wisdom of the meals and room tax cut from 9% to 8.5%, which is costing the state $20 million a year. Who wants this one?
I can speak to a little bit of the history of that. So the meals and rooms and meals and rentals, that's the same tax. It's actually written as both in law, depending on which part of law you're looking at. Someone may have also heard rooms and meals, right? We're all talking about the same tax here. The meals and rentals tax was an 8% tax up until 2010, when it was raised to 9%. to support state revenues in the era of the Great Recession. The state had a lot of revenue go away as a result of the Great Recession. That was not unique to New Hampshire. It happened to lots of states. And that's where the state made lots of curtailments to its own services and to aid shared with cities and towns, right? That was a lot of that happened in that 2008 to 2011 era, so to speak. So that reduction in the tax rate from 9% to 8.5%, that happened in October 2021. So it had gone up to 9, and it was 9 for about 11 years, and then it went back down to 8.5. The meals and rentals tax is the second largest tax revenue source the state has been sort of a workhorse, reliable tax revenue source, other than the pandemic, where a lot of us changed our going out to eat habits and our traveling habits, right? It has grown pretty consistently every year. Reducing it from 9% to 8.5% does have a pretty significant revenue impact in the first state budget in which it was enacted. The impact was about $30.4 million was the projected impact as to what revenue was lost. Also, some of the foregone revenue does affect municipalities because 30% of meals and rentals tax revenue is shared with cities and towns on a per capita basis. So if you lower that total, the 30% gets smaller too. And to put it in context, if you pay $24 for a meal at a restaurant, then going from 9% to 8.5% means you've saved 12 cents, right? So there's not a lot of evidence that would have a lot of impact on economic activity. Indeed, I did hear one person testify to the Ways and Means Committee in the House that there wasn't any impact that person identified, and that person is usually an individual who is approving of lower taxes. So there's not a lot of evidence that it's actually done anything to change economic activity, especially change economic activity in a favorable manner, and it has reduced state revenue.
Okay. John Barrett of 7674 said, "Thank goodness for Gary's reporting and journalistic integrity and in-depth NH mission to hold leaders accountable." Another fan for Gary. And also I need to note that, Gary, you are breaking up every once in a while. Your feed is breaking, I'm not sure. Also, Phil Slutton has put in the chat the property taxes in New Hampshire, how they work and how they compare. There's a link in the chat for anybody who would wish to access that. And on to I.S. McGregor. Attitudes toward taxation and what citizens want in their society need to be discussed. See the Patriotic Millionaires and Vanessa Williamson's The Price of Democracy. Is anyone familiar with either of these documents? The Patriotic Millionaire?
Yeah, The Price of Democracy is a book about the history of taxation in the United States and some of the differences in attitudes towards taxation. There's some interesting stories in it, including around I should say, Williamson tries to counter the idea that a lot of the American Revolution was about taxation without representation. Not that that wasn't part of it, but that part of the Boston Tea Party, for example, was not a protest against the taxation itself, but a protest against unfair taxation and unfair subsidizing for example, the British East India Company. And that manifested itself in a different way. Now, I'm grossly oversimplifying, right? There's a whole book on this. But I wanted to give folks a flavor for, as far as I know, of what's in that Price of Democracy piece. And I think Gary had something else that he wanted to speak up about these as well.
Well, yeah, that book in particular. I mean, she has the attitude, or she has the theory that taxation is actually an investment. People look at it as an investment in the democracy, and her point is that people are happiest actually when they're paying taxes because they feel like they're contributing to things.
That's a good point of view. Okay, Adam Hurd, 9230. I understand that a lot of tax on charitable income is in turn given to charities. Can you elaborate on this in terms of the amount of revenues and how it works? Is that a fact?
I'm not sure what she's talking about.
So I think what this is, and I think there may be clarification further down,
Okay.
but the state legalizes certain types of gambling, right? And that includes the state lottery itself, the scratch tickets, as well as Keno and historic horse racing, now the new video lottery terminals that people can use, sports betting, iLottery, right? These are all ways that the state has sanctioned certain types of gaming that generate revenue. The nominal reason for that sanctioning, and going back to the 1960s when we were the first state to have a modern lottery system, is to generate revenue, particularly for education, and generate public revenue, right? It's not a tax revenue source, but people can participate, and not everyone wins on average. On average, people lose, but some people win, and the rest of the folks who participate pay into what becomes, at least part of it, becomes aid for local public education. There is, however, a component of state law that applies to at least many of these operations, not the state lottery itself, to my knowledge, but for example, a historic horse racing venue. My understanding is that the 35% of their earnings have to go to charitable contributions, right? Have to go to charities, basically. And there are charities that will then sign up with these, places where gambling goes on. You could call them casinos if you'd like. They sign up for a period of time. So do you have a couple days that you sign up for, a week that you sign up for? If you are a charity, like one of the many charities participating in New Hampshire Gives Today, right? And you want a portion of that revenue, that is something that the charity and the casino can work together on directly, and that gambling establishment, or establishment where gambling goes on, then has to, as part of its operations under state law, give that 35% to the charity. And some charities, will have tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars as a result of that, depending on the operation that they're working with. That is separate from the revenue that comes into the state, that is the profits from lottery commission activities. Right. So it's part of the regulation of these activities, is that there has to be these like private entity to private entity agreements that result in more revenue for charities in the state. But then the state also, in some cases, you could just call it directly a tax, right? The state then says, of your revenues, for example, of your video lottery terminal revenues, there's a 31% effectively a tax on that. And those dollars then go to the state for other operations. Also, for the state lottery itself, the profits from that go to the state for other operations, particularly funding education in this case, or in that particular case. So there's a whole bunch of different revenue streams there, and I'm sure I'm sounding just as clear as muddy water, right? Like it's not particularly transparent in terms of how all the dollars flow, but the state has a tiered set of where these dollars should flow, depending on which slice of legalized gambling in the state you're talking about.
Gary, do you want to speak to this as well?
No, that's fine.
Well,
I
go
think
ahead,
I've
Nancy.
heard rumblings that those dollars that are now going to charities, that they're going to eventually end up in the general fund.
It's a significant amount of money, and I can't tell you I've heard anything concrete, maybe things that qualify as rumblings, Nancy, to use your term.
Yeah.
I don't know of any specific proposal at this time. One might be out there, one might not be. I don't know, but it is a significant amount of money, and the state has, over the last 10 years, in most cases, decreased the amount of revenue that it collects, but it has increased the amount of revenue that it collects from legalized gambling. Right. That is a place where the state has actively expanded opportunities for the state to collect revenue, whereas most other ways the state has interacted with its revenue sources have been to decrease them relative to what they would have been.
Okay. IS McGregor is saying, I'm pretty sure people are okay with taxes as long as they're affordable, fairly levied, easy to pay, and the benefits are evident in taxpayers' lives. Are we happy with the taxes that we are charged?
Depends on which ones we're talking about, isn't it?
I guess any of them, huh?
It's always about whose ox is getting gored, right?
Oh, those poor oxes.
Yeah.
Andrew Volinsky is weighing in 9328. I read all of Phil and Gary's writing. I'm sure he does. And Adam Hurd 9230 said he meant gambling tax. Adam
Right.
Hurd, I understand that much of the revenue from tax on gambling is in turn given to charities. And we've talked about that. It's my understanding that a gambling institution cannot even operate unless it has set up this fund to charities, that they have charities that then get 10 days worth of their year of revenue, and they share that revenue then.
By
They share
law, the charities have to get 35%.
35? Okay.
Right. Yeah.
And that
And there's,
can be, I'm sorry.
no, I was just gonna say, and that 35%, right, that doesn't flow through the state government currently, right? It's something the state requires, but the money doesn't go through the state budget. It's a transfer. My understanding
Right.
is the transfer from private entity to private entity. There are, however, then effectively taxes that are on certain types of legalized gambling operations that do go to the state, and those dollars get used for other public services, typically education, although as Gary pointed out, not always in the case of video lottery terminals where some of it will go to the general fund.
Nancy, do you know how many charities there are in the state of New Hampshire?
Well, there's 701 that are part of New Hampshire Gives, and that's a small percentage. I'm thinking around 7,000. There's a lot of, and I think there's a lot of charities that don't even know about this opportunity to get money from the casinos. And I know, in full transparency, InDepthNH.org, we're a nonprofit, so we did sign up with a casino a couple of years ago, and I think we received some funding from them for over 2 or 3 years. And then it started to become a little bit too political, and we felt that it was more of an ethical question that we hadn't raised properly, so we stopped applying. Well, actually, we didn't stop applying. They kicked us out.
A badge of
Now that I
honor.
remember, they kicked us out because the board said we weren't suitable or something. And I think that's because we're a nonprofit news outlet.
Right.
And so at that point, I thought, we just don't want any part of that.
Right.
I've heard that some charities get like over $100,000.
Right.
And, we never, I think ours was more in the $20,000 range. But I mean, for a small charity, that's a lot of money. So I really wish it was fairly divvied up for charities. And it seems to me there's a lot of going on with getting in with the right casinos that are going to make a lot of money. We never had a big shot casino, but we were happy with a small amount of money.
Exactly. But again, it's a
Ethically, I
disproportionate.
don't think we should not be involved at this point.
It just seems disproportionate that the amount of charities in the state aren't getting, most are not getting any money, and they should, but that's another topic for another time. And okay, let's go. At NH-DEM, I think if the state funded public education much higher and certainly more equitably, it would answer a lot of our problems. Eventually, there wouldn't be bad versus good schools, no competing for good programs, and our housing problems would be eased because we wouldn't be so reluctant to have more families move into town, which raises school costs. And she's asking for comments on that statement.
I'm not sure I don't see anything wrong with it. That's for sure. I mean, it's true. I mean, the inequity and the public education funding between the property poor communities and the property wealthy communities is just phenomenal. And I mean, it's worse now than it was when the Claremont lawsuit was settled. So I mean, that's an ongoing problem. And part of the problem is that the state is, last in the country in its support for public education. By a long shot. I mean, you can double the money and you're still in the last place, what New Hampshire state pays for public education. And until you start equalizing the educational opportunities around the state, you're always going to have the good school, bad school, and all these little tricks that they're even pulling, like the open enrollment and so on. I mean, it makes the situation worse. It doesn't make it any better.
Right, right.
And I'll say,
go ahead,
sorry,
Phil.
go ahead, Beverly.
No, you go on.
As a percentage, so if we look at public education funding nationwide and look at revenue per pupil, right? So a way we can standardize it across the 50 states. Yeah, 50 states plus DC. I'll add that in here. If we look at fiscal year 2022 data, which is the most recent that we have, we can compare across the country, then in terms of the total amount of revenue raised per pupil, New Hampshire is 10th, meaning there are 8 states plus DC because it's one of the 9 up there ahead of us. If we look at the total amount of revenue that comes from the state government per pupil, then we're 34th. And if we look at local government revenue per pupil, we're 4th. So local governments are really carrying a lot of the weight here, so to speak. And which means local property taxes, effectively, because that is the only major tax revenue source that local governments have, and they don't really have control over the other revenue sources in most cases. And if we look at the total amount of revenue and look at the percentage that comes from the state, that's where New Hampshire ranks last, right? So we're not last in dollar terms, and we're not last by a huge margin, right? And Nebraska and South Dakota are actually pretty close to us, but we are last on the list in terms of the percentage of local revenue, pardon me, the percentage of revenue per pupil that comes from the state government versus other sources, and almost all of that is local government. And by the way, that's counting the statewide education property tax as state aid, even though it's raised and retained locally.
Interesting. Dead last. Okay, Michael Cahill, 2403, is commenting, with charitable gaming, the 35% is only from table games. With their historic horse racing slot machines, the charities receive just 8.75%. So a little comment on that.
Yep.
And
Many thanks to Representative Cahill for coming in with the facts. I appreciate it there.
It's okay. Michael Cahill, 2403, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All
I
right,
mean, unless there's another Michael Cahill, but I'm pretty sure that's Representative Cahill.
Good. At NH-Dem is saying, tax the guy behind the tree, exclamation point. I don't know what that means, but it's funny. And I read the comments, folks.
There's an old saying that used to go around, don't tax me, tax the guy behind the tree.
Oh,
That's where it comes from.
very good.
Most people describe New Hampshire tax system, don't tax me, tax the person.
Tax the other guy, right?
We always go out, we want people to buy our cigarettes, to buy our liquor, and come stay here so they can pay the rooms and meals tax,
Okay, at Sharon Beatty, Beaty 3356 said, I was happy to pay dividends tax, seemed fair to me. And one more comment from at NH-Dem. Again, though, the definition of charity needs to be examined. The disparity between those can be amazing. And finally, right now, I've got Adam Hurd 9230. How can the statewide property education tax be called a state tax when no dollars flow to the state from the tax?
So Gary, I can talk about the mechanics, and then you want to add on top of that? Okay. So the statewide education property tax, it's a really significant state tax revenue source. It used to have a rate that varied every year. It's been set to raise $363 million since 2005, unadjusted for inflation. So while in most years, total property taxes, local property taxes go up faster than inflation, the $363 million that comes from the statewide education property tax is actually going down relative to other revenue sources. Now, the statewide education property tax, and I know there are people on this call who know much more about it in much more detail than I do, so I'm going to grossly oversimplify here. The statewide education property tax is a state tax in that if the state did not have it, it would be obligated to find other revenue from some other sources to pay for its share of local public education under state law, right? So that's important to remember. The statewide education property tax is on the revenue side of funding for local public education. Now, where that revenue comes from is the state tells local governments, does a calculation based on statewide property, and says, here's how much we would raise if we applied this rate roughly evenly across the state. How much then would be raised by each town and city in the state based on the property value within it? And those amounts then are basically sent to the towns and cities as a warrant saying, here's how much you have to raise to fund the share of local public education that we owe you from the statewide education property tax. So If you're a local government, you get basically you're told by the state you have to raise this much based on your property. And then if that's going to fund a certain number of students, right, a certain amount of adequate education aid based on the education funding formula that we owe you, anything above that amount, we're going to send you from other sources, right? It's going to be from lottery commission revenues. It's going to be from the business profits tax, the business enterprise tax, the portions of the real estate transfer tax, and the tobacco tax that the state raises and dedicates to the education trust fund, which funds local public education, or at least the state's portion of it. So that amount is the statewide education property tax. It is part of the calculus when the state is saying how much are we sending to towns and cities, but it never leaves the community. Has to be funded by it's state dollars, but it's offsetting what the state otherwise owes with the local property tax base. Now, the dollars used to be shared between communities. People might remember the term donor town and receiver town. The state used to collect the money from those communities that raised more than they needed to fund the amount of kids the amount that was owed through the statewide education property tax. The state used to take this additional amount. Let's say this is how much you raise in statewide education property tax. This is the amount of money that the state owes you through the education funding formula. This additional amount used to go back to the state to be redistributed in the education funding formula. That has not been true since 2011. Right? The local governments have kept their total amount since 2011, even if they raise more than they need, so to speak, to fund the state's portion of funding for local public education. Another clear as mud thing, I'm sorry about that, but that's the mechanics of the basics. Again, there's a lot of detail that I glossed over, but the basics of the statewide education property tax. And if that statewide education property tax didn't exist, then the state, unless it changed its education funding formula, the state would have to find that money that it owes those communities through the education funding formula from some other source. And that is why it's a state tax. The money never goes to the state, but it is raised locally to help offset the state's cost.
And Gary, do you have any comments?
Well, it goes back to the whole idea of the Constitution requires that that taxation be proportional and reasonable. And when you start talking about property taxes, and you start funding education with property taxes, such as they're not proportional and they're not reasonable, I guess. But they're certainly not proportional. They vary all over the place. And when you do the statewide property tax, so you do
You're breaking up, Gary.
equalized valuation. Well, you're doing it through the equalized valuation so that the rate is supposedly the same for everybody. So that's why you can call that a state tax, and therefore it's also proportional, so it's legal. And that's when we get into the court cases we just had. The contention is that the state isn't paying its full share, and therefore these other statewide these other local property taxes are picking up the difference, and they're not proportional, and therefore it's unconstitutional. And that's where we get into all the fun times and all the legal stuff. And the judges found that in both the Conval and the Rand case. Conval didn't actually go for the property tax being unconstitutional. What the Rand case did, they said, it's going to be unconstitutional. All these local property taxes are all over the place, and they're still funding education. So it's not paying their share.
Bill, any follow-up on that, or are we good?
No, I think we're all set.
All right, Sharon Beatty comes back in and said, Andrew's plan seems fair. Legislature needs to get over itself and adopt it. And Julie Gilman -H4P is saying, where can I find data on what the state revenue would be if we instituted a 1% sales tax?
I just want to butt in for a minute. I think we put a link to Andrew Valinsky's 3-3 tax plan in the chat, and it comes with a calculator. People can see if they would pay more or less under that tax plan, and it's very simply explained, but that should be in the chat room. And if not, you can find his op-ed on InDepthNH.org.
Okay. All right. So,
And
yes.
I'll say I don't have the data for what a 1% sales tax would be in New Hampshire. And Gary, I'm trying to remember the last time there was a bill that proposed such a thing that could be a benchmark. It was probably too long ago to have a useful number now. Um, it's probably a number you could find if you looked at, for example, gross state product and tried to tease out what is consumption in the state, like what are the sales of goods in the state. But then there's the question of what are you taxing, right? Are you including everything in the sales tax? Are you including just goods and not services, which is what a lot of sales tax do in some ways? Are you including groceries, right? Some sales taxes will be exempt groceries in some states, for example. So there's a lot of questions then, like the billionaire tax question, right? There are a lot of questions about and the cannabis one, how you implement it, because how you implement it matters a lot for how much revenue it raises.
And also, I mean, we already have a lot of little sales taxes. We have the beer tax, the cigarette tax, we have the communications tax, we have the real estate transfer tax. I mean, there are all these other things that normally would be in a general sales tax that we already. So the problem that most people found when they start talking about a general sales tax in New Hampshire is it doesn't raise the money kind of revenue that most people think it would, because we already tax these things. So it's not such a huge number to look at.
And the meals and rentals tax is the second largest tax revenue source the state has, right? And it's a tax on sales for both goods and services, although pretty heavily rooted in services in that case. And Beverly, if I could, just one more thing about a sales tax is if you look at the modeling from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, this goes back to the fairly levied taxes. Sales taxes, again, depending on how they're structured, but sales taxes tend to ask substantially higher amounts of incomes from lower income households than from higher income households, just because of the percentage of a household's budget that goes to buying things, especially buying physical things that are taxed, right, under a sales tax. Sales taxes tend to ask a lot more of lower income households than of higher income households.
In other words, they're regressive.
Nancy,
I
did you want to
think-
add something?
I think from the letters we received, a lot of people aren't satisfied with their property tax and what the state is doing to downshift more to the local communities, the municipalities. And we were just chatting, trying to figure out, what can people do? And I think, as a reporter, when people are running for election, I wish we could cover every single race for the House and Senate and ask people what their opinions are on tax, how to make it more fair, or maybe they think it's fair already. But what are some other ways people can let their elected officials know that they're not satisfied, or maybe they are satisfied, maybe they want to send kudos to their elected officials. But any ideas on how they can express themselves? And like I said, the ones that we received, they weren't rude, they weren't nasty, they were just really ready for conversation. Maybe we'll have another video. Will everybody come back? We'll just keep doing videos.
Well, now is the time for people to check in. We're into the political season. We got another couple of 3 days here to go before the sign up period ends. So
Friday, yep. Friday's the last
right.
day to sign.
These guys are going to be out and about, and they're going to be asking people for their votes, and people should go find them and tell them what they want. Tell them what they think.
And I'll say once we get to the state budget process too, which will start up next year, 2027, I mean, people can always contact their legislators, their elected officials, and provide feedback and insight, et cetera. But I think it's important to note that there are relatively narrow windows that are the formal public input windows for the state budget process. As large as the state budget is, the current state budget's almost $16 billion. There's a public hearing in the House, which is based on before the House makes its changes, usually, which is based on what the governor proposed. And there's a public hearing in the Senate, and that's based largely on what the House has proposed, and it's before the Senate's changes. Sometimes legislators will, go on the road, so to speak, and have more public hearings and find other ways to collect public input. But a lot of the revenue and expenditure changes, including aid to local governments that we've been, referencing throughout this conversation about taxes, a lot of those changes are made in the state budget itself. And that state budget process is a long process, but there are only so many opportunities that are formal public opportunities for members of the public to weigh in. And I did want to highlight that is at least in terms of the public and formal and not directly contacting your legislator part of the process, but obviously that's something that people could do too. There are only limited opportunities, even though the state budget is a huge piece of public policy in New Hampshire.
And it seems from watching that process that, the lawmakers aren't bound by whatever input they're receiving from the public. So it's a good thing to watch. We're really lucky since COVID. You can get all of these committees on YouTube, and actually we'll put this video tonight, we'll put this on InDepthNH.org's YouTube page. Yes, we have a YouTube page. And but they're not bound by it by that point. I watched a lot of input on certain bills that were totally ignored.
We are a representative democracy and not a direct democracy. Yes.
Thank you, Phil. Good
Okay,
reminder.
we're about 9 minutes before we have to close out, but I've got at New Boston Rep. It's saying the SWEPT, SWEPT, is a shell game, plain and simple. What's the SWEPT, SWEPT?
That's statewide education property tax.
Oh,
what
I see.
Gary
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I,
yeah.
So
Okay.
Gary, go ahead. Sorry.
But I mean, everything is an income tax, frankly. I mean, it's all coming out of your income one way or the other. But I mean, the statewide property tax is like taking $1 out of your right pocket and putting it into your left pocket. In the right pocket, it's a local tax, a local property tax, and you put it in your left pocket, it's a statewide property tax. I mean, it's a shell game.
Yeah, yeah, it is a shell
This
game.
is money.
Right.
This is money that the year before they put this in was local money, but now we're calling it state. And the year that they put it in, now it's state money. And it's still the same money. It's still your money, and it's just the way they're dealing with it. They're putting their hands on it. The state's saying this is ours now. Well, it was the local, but now it's theirs. And as long as the schools get paid, everybody says, okay, I guess.
So would there be any tax reform that could generate the most stable revenue for New Hampshire, but while causing the least economic disruption? What's our solution? All
Very
right,
good
come on,
question.
boys.
So I'll say that if we're looking for revenue stability, property taxes are actually relatively stable from year to year when it comes to state tax revenue options. So I'll say that out front. The revenue stability that we don't have at the state level, which we've seen particularly in the post-pandemic era, but a little bit before as well, is that we rely more than any other state in terms of state tax revenue sources. So not counting local at this point, we rely more than any other state on corporate income taxes, particularly our business profits tax or business enterprise tax, right? And corporate income taxes, business profits, move faster than other parts of the economy. So a corporate profit dollar might change faster than income does, might change faster than sales do, might change faster than property value does. And that volatility means that New Hampshire has in recent years crept up in volatility in terms of tax revenue volatility relative to the average state. We used to be pretty close to the middle, and we actually have a pretty wide array of revenue sources. As Gary noted, we have what are called selective sales taxes in a lot of instances, and that does in some cases help stabilize revenue, but are leaning on the business profits tax for a lot of our state tax revenue does mean we're subject to more volatility, at least in recent years, relative to what we've seen in other states. So I would say that in terms of you asked about a solution, Beverly, and I don't know that I have any sort of silver bullet, so to speak, or one solution for it. But I would say that if we're looking for revenue stability, that may be a component of the question, but maybe not the only component of the question, because right now the revenue that's collected may not be particularly equitable in terms of its impacts on households when you cross municipal borders, because so much is reliant on local property tax bases. But if we're looking for year to year, then at least from the government's perspective or a government's perspective, property taxes are relatively stable. So maybe it's one question to ask, but not the only question to ask when we're thinking about how does state and local government raise revenue.
Which revenue sources are the most vulnerable? If we have a downturn in the economy, which ones are going to be our biggest problem?
Well, we have evidence for that from, business profits tax. I would say meals and rentals tax took a big hit during the pandemic, although that was sort of a unique phenomena. And also, we're all going out to eat more since the pandemic, if you believe the revenue numbers. Real estate transfer tax is particularly vulnerable as well to economic swings. The interest and dividends tax moved a lot with the stock market because it depended a lot on dividend and distribution income. And when stocks are doing better, that generates more revenue on that front. Of course, that's not a revenue source for the state anymore, so that's less of a variable now. As insurance premiums have gone up, insurance premium tax revenue has done very well, but that can swing too, although it doesn't swing as much. So there's, and I'll say one revenue source that's vulnerable right now because of federal policy changes is the Medicaid enhancement tax. The state isn't going to be able to raise as much money through the Medicaid enhancement tax in the future as it does right now, because the federal government is limiting what are called provider taxes on hospitals, and the Medicaid enhancement tax is one of those. So it means that because of federal law changes, by 2031, the state's going to have to find several $100 million more revenue from some other source to fund ongoing Medicaid services. So that's a very concrete example, Beverly, of like something that's a policy change, not just a
Right.
recession that has affected our revenues or will affect our revenues in the state.
Sounds very dire. All right, folks, we're 4 minutes out. Gary, do you want to have any final comments that you'd like to say?
Well, I just saw what we're talking about in terms of tax stability. I mean, generally speaking, the broader the base of the tax, the more stable it is. And the broader the base of the tax, the less impact it has because it can be a smaller amount of money. So the broader you can make it, a tax base, the more stable and the less impact it will have on people. And that's where we are. And that's not where New Hampshire is. So it would take a major overhaul of the state's tax system to be really much more stable than it is now.
And Phil, any final comments?
Any final comments? I guess I would encourage folks to. There was a question up above about fair levying of taxes, and I think it's important to remember. Gary made a comment before about how this is all coming out of people's incomes anyway. It's just a question of like which income and for what reason. I think it's important to remember that right now, the state tax structure that we have, it's not a consistent slope in terms of higher income equals lower effective tax rate. It's not true in all facets of it, but property taxes, at least if you look at the modeling from the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy, asks a lot more of the lowest income households and middle income households as a percentage of income than the highest income households. And I think that when people are thinking about how could taxes change, is that particular structure something that people would consider fairly levied? Some people might say it is fair because higher income households may rely on services less and should government be funded more through user fees? Some people might say that households at lower incomes have less ability to pay, and it's a bigger impact on their livelihoods. And there's a fair bit of research and evidence that it's a bigger impact on the economy when you tax households that have lower incomes or take resources away in various ways from households that have lower incomes than those with higher incomes. So I think it's important to remember that when we're thinking about big picture, how does government raise revenue, and particularly tax revenue, the impacts on individual households and how those flow to the rest of the economy, there's research there out there about it. There's ways that we can understand what are the trade-offs, and every policy has trade-offs, but what are the trade-offs of some of those decisions? So I think that's important for folks to remember when they're thinking about all this.
And
I'd
Nancy,
like to just add something quickly too. I know we're running low on time.
you've got the last minute. You got the last
Okay.
minute, Nancy.
You know, luckily, the members of the House and the Senate and the governor, they have to run every 2 years in New Hampshire. So try to find out information about your local state reps and local senators that are making these decisions, and vote. Get out and vote this year. We'll do our part. InDepthNH.org. We'll try to bring you as much information as we possibly can, and let's vote.
Well, and I've got LB 8960 enjoyed the information. At New Boston Rep said, thank you all. Gary, you are such a gem. And Phil, such a gift, just such a gift to us all. And at NH-DEM, thank you all. In depth, Phil, Gary, and the great questioners. Very good. What a great event. And I thought a lot of good representation. It is now 7:30, and I think we're going to be closing off our program for the evening then. And thank you, Phil. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Nancy. It's been really eye-opening.
Thanks for the
Montana, are
opportunity.
we good? I'm sorry. Yes, Phil, thank you.
Mhm.